The rain poured relentlessly as Grace worked the night shift, but nothing could have prepared her for the surreal moment a lion walked into the hospital, carrying a baby in its mouth. With it, a secret that would change everything. The storm outside raged with fury, lightning illuminating the sky in flashes, as if nature itself was on the edge of some great unknown. Inside St. John Hospital, the emergency room was a haven of constant noise. Beeping monitors, the rush of nurses, the soft murmur of worried families. Grace, a seasoned nurse working the late shift, glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Exhausted but alert, she took a deep sip from her lukewarm coffee, trying to stay awake. She could feel the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders when suddenly the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Grace barely had time to react. Standing in the doorway, framed by the storm outside, was a massive African lion. Its golden mane soaked from the rain, the creature moved slowly into the ER, its eyes locked onto Grace's. In its mouth it carried a bundle wrapped in a blue blanket, its delicate weight seemingly nothing to the mighty animal. The room froze. Nurses, doctors, and patients stared, caught in a mixture of fear and disbelief. Yet the lion remained calm, its steady gaze full of purpose, as if it belonged there. The chaos it caused was sharp and sudden, but it seemed to hold a silent, undeniable power that commanded the room's attention. Something extraordinary had just entered. The sound of the storm outside was drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the lion's paws on the polished hospital floor. Grace's heart skipped a beat as the massive creature, with its golden mane dripping wet, made its way toward the nurse's station. Each step was deliberate, powerful, as if the lion were a force of nature itself, calmly asserting its presence in the midst of chaos. The low rumble of its steps echoed in the silence that had fallen over the room. Grace stood frozen, her mind racing. Could she be imagining this? The fatigue from her long shift, the strange hour, or the storm outside, all of it made her wonder if she was hallucinating. But no, the lion's gaze was too intense, too real. It was impossibly calm, its eyes fixed on hers with an intelligence that seemed far beyond anything she had ever seen in an animal. There was something human-like in those eyes, something ancient and knowing, like it understood everything about her in that single piercing glance. As if in a trance, the lion lowered its head, its golden mane brushing the ground as it gently placed the blue-wrapped bundle on the floor. The baby. Its tiny body, pale and still, looked fragile against the beast's powerful frame. Then, as if on cue, the baby let out a soft cry. Grace snapped back to reality, her breath catching in her throat. The lion's presence was no longer the only thing that commanded her attention. The child needed her. Her training kicked in. The room seemed to breathe again as the tension broke, and the lion, with one final lingering look, stepped back, watching as Grace rushed to the baby's side. Grace's hands shook as she knelt beside the baby, her professional instincts snapping into place despite the strange and overwhelming situation. Her heart raced, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. The infant, barely a few hours old, if that, was wrapped in a blue blanket that had been carelessly tossed aside by the lion's gentle mouth. Grace's fingers hovered over the baby's tiny chest, checking for any signs of life, but her mind was clouded with confusion. The storm had raged outside, yet the baby was inexplicably warm. Her fingers moved swiftly over its skin, checking the vitals, steady pulse, stable temperature. A sense of disbelief gnawed at her. How was this possible? The child was unharmed, remarkably healthy, considering the weather and the odd circumstances. There were no signs of distress, no signs of trauma. Nothing explained how this baby had arrived here, carried by a lion, so calm and alive. Grace glanced up, feeling the weight of the lion's gaze on her. Its large golden eyes were fixed on her every movement, unblinking, as though it were silently assessing her actions. It was an eerie sensation, a quiet pressure that made her feel as if the lion understood exactly what she was doing, as though it trusted her with the baby. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Someone help!" she called, her voice cutting through the stunned silence in the room. A few nurses shuffled forward, reluctant to approach the lion. Their eyes widened as they looked at the massive creature standing still at the far end of the room, watching them with unnerving stillness. The tension in the room was palpable. Despite the fear, The situation demanded action. The baby was still alive. Grace motioned for a colleague to bring a gurney, and together they carefully transferred the child to the nursery. The lion didn't move, its eyes tracking their every step. With each breath of air, the hospital seemed to grow quieter, as though the lion had somehow cast a spell of calm over the chaos. As the baby was taken away, Grace looked back. The lion stood motionless, watching them from the doorway, its massive form like a guardian standing vigil. The storm outside seemed to intensify, but inside, it was as if time itself had slowed. The lion's presence had changed everything, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary situation. It was something much larger, something beyond explanation. As Grace carefully checked the baby's blanket, her fingers brushed against something hard hidden inside the folds. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. It was a small, golden medallion, delicately attached to the fabric with a string. Her heart skipped a beat as she gently removed it, the smooth, cool metal catching the dim light of the room. Engraved on the medallion was an inscription. To Anna, protect him at all costs. The words seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite explain, as though they carried weight far beyond the simplicity of their meaning. Grace's fingers trembled as she held it up, the gold catching a faint glow that seemed to shimmer in the hospital's fluorescent lighting. A sense of unease washed over her. The medallion was beautiful, ancient even, and the glow only deepened the mystery. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, and yet it felt somehow familiar. The connection to the lion who had placed the baby in her care was undeniable. Was this some kind of sign? Grace felt a chill run down her spine. The staff around her had already started whispering, exchanging confused glances, but none of them seemed to understand the depth of what was unfolding. Her instincts, however, told her something much deeper was at play. The baby was whisked away to the ICU, and the medallion stayed warm in her palm. She tucked it into her pocket, unwilling to leave it behind, her mind racing with questions she had no answers to. The lion's appearance, the baby's miraculous health, the medallion, it was all connected somehow. But how? And why had this all happened tonight? Grace stepped outside the ER for a moment, feeling the weight of everything pressing on her chest. The storm had begun to subside, but her mind was still swirling with chaos. She needed a moment to breathe, to clear her head. The cool air hit her face as she leaned against the cold brick of the hospital's exterior, trying to steady her nerves. The lion, the baby, the medallion, nothing about it made sense, and yet everything felt connected in a way she couldn't explain. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the automatic doors sliding open. She turned to see a man, drenched to the bone, practically stumbling into the ER. His clothes were soaked, his face a mask of desperation. In his trembling hands he held a crumpled photograph, an image of a woman cradling a baby. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the woman in the picture. "Please," the man gasped, his voice shaking. "I'm looking for my son. My wife, Anna, there was an accident. The baby wasn't in the car when they found it. Please, tell me he's here." Grace froze. The name Anna? She knew it. It echoed in her mind like a distant memory, tying everything together in an instant. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced down at the photograph. The woman in the image looked exactly like the name on the medallion she had just found. The man's voice trembled with emotion as he explained further. Anna was supposed to be traveling when the crash happened. The baby, he was supposed to be with her. She always wore a medallion, just like this one. Grace's pulse quickened. The medallion, the one she had found on the baby, was the same one he was describing. It hit her like a wave, crashing over her in a rush of realization. This wasn't just a random emergency, this was something much bigger. She wasn't just a nurse in a hospital anymore. She had become part of a story that reached beyond her understanding. The man took a shaky step forward, his voice hoarse as he introduced himself. "I'm Ryan Walker," he said, his eyes filled with both grief and hope. "And you? You've seen him, haven't you? The lion." Grace nodded slowly, still processing the whirlwind of events. There was something in Ryan's eyes, an understanding, a quiet desperation, that made the whole situation feel impossibly real. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she couldn't help but feel that the room had shifted somehow. They were no longer just two strangers in a hospital. This was something far greater. Ryan went on, his voice steadier now, yet still filled with emotion. Anna, my wife, she had this connection with Aurelius. She believed he wasn't just a lion, he's a guardian, a protector. His words hung in the air, like a spell weaving the past and present together. Grace felt her heart race as she listened, the pieces falling into place. Ryan spoke of Anna's deep belief in guardianship, the idea that certain animals were chosen to watch over people, guiding them through life's dangers. Aurelius has been protecting people for years, Ryan said, his eyes unfocused as he spoke of his wife. Anna always talked about it. How these animals were more than mere creatures, how they were sent to protect those they loved, those they were meant to guide. Grace's mind flashed back to the lion's eyes. The way it had looked at her earlier, how it hadn't just been watchful but protective, almost divine in its focus. A deep, ancient wisdom had radiated from him. It wasn't just an animal, it was something more, something beyond nature. Wait, Grace interrupted. Her voice soft but certain. The lion, he wasn't just here randomly, he was sent to protect the baby. The realization hit her all at once, like a sudden burst of light in the darkness. The lion wasn't an accidental visitor, he had been drawn to this hospital for a reason. Ryan's expression softened as he looked at her. Yes, he whispered. Aurelius was sent to protect Leo. My son, he's the one. Grace felt her heart swell with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The pieces had finally clicked. The lion, the medallion, the baby, this was no ordinary event. It was part of something ancient, something far bigger than anything she could have imagined. Aurelius hadn't just appeared by chance. He had come to fulfill a promise, to safeguard the child destined for something extraordinary. As the baby was carefully wheeled to the ICU, Grace stood frozen by the nurse's station, her eyes flickering back to the entrance. The lion was there, standing perfectly still, just beyond the ER doors. He seemed to be waiting, silent, regal, and knowing. There was an undeniable calm about him, as if he understood that his job was complete. Grace's pulse quickened as she watched him, a quiet reverence filling the room. The chaos had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken connection between her and the lion. The hospital's bright lights reflected off his golden mane, and his eyes, those wise, knowing eyes, locked with hers one last time. It was as if he was confirming something between them, silently acknowledging the unspoken bond formed in those brief, intense moments. Without a sound, the lion turned, his powerful body moving with the grace of a shadow. His paws made no noise against the floor. Yet, as he walked, Grace could swear she could feel the air shift, the space around them holding its breath. He made his way toward the automatic doors, his massive frame casting a brief, fleeting shadow across the lobby. And then, with one final, deliberate glance back, like a guardian taking his leave, the lion stepped out into the night. The doors slid shut behind him, and the storm outside began to quiet, the howling wind fading into a gentle, almost peaceful drizzle. All that remained were the faint paw prints on the floor and the lingering sense of awe. The staff stood in stunned silence, unsure of what had just transpired, but certain of one thing. The world had just shifted, and they were now part of something far greater than they could ever explain. The next morning, as dawn light filtered through the hospital windows, Grace couldn't shake the surreal events of the night before. The memory of the lion's presence, his quiet grace, his protective gaze, kept playing over and over in her mind. She walked the sterile hallways of the hospital, the usual hum of machines and soft murmurs of staff filling the air. But there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The chaos of the previous evening had somehow left behind a sense of serenity, a peacefulness that seemed to settle in the very walls of the hospital. Grace found herself drawn to the nursery, her feet carrying her almost instinctively. She paused just outside the door, staring in through the glass. A soft, golden glow emanated from inside, casting long shadows and giving the room an ethereal, otherworldly quality. Leo, the baby, lay peacefully in his crib, his small face serene, as if the storm that had rocked his world had never touched him. It was then that Grace realized, with a clarity that sent a shiver down her spine, that her purpose at the hospital had changed. It wasn't just about caring for the sick anymore. It was about protecting, witnessing, and understanding things beyond the physical realm. She exhaled slowly, her eyes lingering on the baby. Would she ever fully understand the connection between Aurelius, the lion, and the child? The mysteries surrounding them seemed infinite, like a thread that wove through the fabric of her life. But maybe she thought some things weren't meant to be understood. Perhaps they were meant to be witnessed, felt in the depths of the soul, and left to unfold in their own time. And with that thought, she turned away, knowing that her journey was far from over.